Welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government and the annual Norman E. Zinnberg Lecture, sponsored by the Zinnberg Fellowship Fund and the Division on Addictions at the Harvard Medical School. My name is Bob Dorwart. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and also here in the Wiener Center at the Kennedy School. First, I'd like to say a few words about Norman Zinnberg and his career and then introduce our speaker. I knew Norman Zinnberg as a teacher and later as a colleague. First paper I read by him was written and published in 1968 when I was an undergraduate here, and the paper was a volume in Daedalus, which argued for the active role of psychiatrists and, by extension, of all physicians in public policy issues. Then from 1977 to 1980, I was a psychiatric resident at the Cambridge Hospital Department of Psychiatry, where Norman was director of education. Norman Zinnberg moved to Boston in 1951, and in 1961 he became lecturer on social relations, remember that, at Harvard, and later in 1973 staff psychiatrist at the Cambridge Hospital, and I'm being selective, of course, in 1982 clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He was a very active consultant to many organizations nationally and internationally. For example, in 1977 he was a coordinator of the task panel on psychoactive drug use and misuse of the President's Commission on Mental Health, and in 1989, until his death, he was a member of the National Commission on Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. He was the author of dozens of scientific papers, he edited numerous books, and he wrote 5 books. I'll mention just 2 of them. One was in 1972, Zinnberg and Robertson, Drugs and the Public, and in 1984, Drug, Set, and Setting, the Basis for Controlled Intoxicant Use. Norman was an original and unconventional thinker who was also a prolific writer and a gifted teacher. And this, I think, provides a logical segue into introducing our speaker for this evening, Dr. Andrew Weil. Before I introduce him, however, I want to briefly acknowledge the person who made this evening possible and who is herself a faculty member at the Kennedy School, Mrs. Dorothy Zinnberg, who is here. Andrew Weil was born in Philadelphia in 1942 and received his bachelor's degree in biology, actually botany, from Harvard in 1964. His senior thesis, I note, was entitled Nutmeg as a Narcotic. And then his MD from Harvard Medical School in 1968. After completing a medical internship at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco, he worked a year with the National Institute of Mental Health and then wrote his first book, The Natural Mind. At present, Dr. Weil is director of the program in integrative medicine in the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona, where he teaches about mind-body interactions and medical botany. He also holds appointments as clinical assistant professor of internal medicine and clinical assistant professor of family and community medicine. He has a general practice in Tucson focusing on natural and preventive medicine and diagnosis. I want to mention in particular his books, which are The Natural Mind, The Marriage of the Sun and the Moon, From Chocolate to Morphine, which is, with Winfred Rosen, which is a lovely book, if you've seen it, Health and Healing, Natural Health, Natural Medicine, and the international bestseller, Spontaneous Healing. He is a frequent lecturer and guest on talk shows, and he is an internationally recognized expert on drugs and drug abuse, addiction, altered states of consciousness, medicinal plants, alternative and holistic medicine, and reforming medical education. And as we read in today's New York Times, he is also online and active on the internet and has his own web page. So pleased to introduce Dr. Weil speaking on the topic of a society of addicts, drugs, and public policy.
Thank you, Dr. Dorwart, and I'm very happy to be here and grateful for the invitation to give the 3rd annual Zinnberg Lecture. I knew Norman Zinnberg as a teacher, a friend, a mentor, colleague. He was one of the most influential persons in my academic career, And in the course of tonight, I'll tell you about some of the philosophy that we shared about drugs and the reasons why we were both very optimistic that our society, despite all appearances to the contrary, can yet come to terms with the presence of psychoactive drugs in our midst. I should say at the beginning that my present work really is focused on reforming medical education, on teaching people about the sources of healing, natural health, and so forth. But I know there are people out there that probably are shocked to discover my notorious past as a writer about psychoactive drugs and addiction. But I see my intellectual career as a seamless evolution, and the current ideas that I have about health and healing come directly from the experiences that I had as a researcher of drugs and studies of addiction. For example, the main thesis of The Natural Mind, which I published in 1972, was that high states, that experiences come not from drugs but originate within the nervous system, that drugs act as triggers or releasers of those experiences. And currently, what I have to say about health and healing is that healing is a phenomenon that originates within, that treatments can release or trigger healing. So I see this as a generalization of an idea that I first saw when looking at drug-related phenomena. And I could draw many other parallels of that sort as well. I'll just give you one. I've been very struck by differences in philosophy underlying Eastern medicine and Western medicine. And one very good example of that is the way that these two systems approach infectious disease. Western medicine has focused entirely on identifying agents of disease and then trying to develop technological weapons against them. That approach has been very successful in the short run, but it raises a lot of questions about its long-term efficacy. There are two problems with relying solely on weapons against agents of disease. The first is that weapons tend to backfire and cause direct harm to you. The second is that the weapons may influence the forms of the things out there that you don't like in worse directions. And I'm sure all of you are aware, and I can tell you that if you read the publications of infectious disease specialists, you would be much more aware of the reality of the fact that we have influenced the evolution of bacteria in horrible ways and are now facing the prospect of coming epidemics of organisms that we will no longer be able to treat. I see a same parallel there with the use of pesticides. We have very clear evidence now that in areas of the country where pesticides have been used heaviest and longest, patterns of insect predation on crops are worse than they were before we ever started to apply pesticides. The Eastern approach has been not so much to worry about the things that are out there, but rather to identify the defensive functions of the human organism and to find ways of strengthening those. That is to make people more resistant to whatever injurious agents are out there. And it seems to me that when I look at the way that our society has dealt with drugs, again, I see a very clear parallel there. Our focus has been to identify those things we don't like and to try to make them go away by training force on them. And I would argue that in the time that we have been using that approach, which is almost a century now, that everything associated with psychoactive drugs has gotten worse in our culture. And I think we are directly responsible for that. And I have long been arguing for a more Chinese approach to the whole problem of drugs and drug abuse, which I'll talk to you some about tonight. I want to just give a few reminiscences of Norman and why he was influential in my life. I met him in the fall of 1961 when, as a sophomore at Harvard College and a botany major, I was also a member of the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. And one of the first major articles that I wrote was a feature about Norman Zinnberg, who I had heard about as being a drug researcher who had different ideas. I was also at that time taking David Reisman's course in American Society, and I wrote as a major paper for that course a critical study of drugs and drug use, which at that time was a very unfashionable subject, and there was not much original thinking about it. And I was told that there was a man in the social relations department who had original thoughts on the subjects. So I went to Norman's house on Scott Street and met him and wrote a profile of him, and we became friends ever since. And that, I can't even estimate the number of hours I spent in the living room and kitchen in the Zinnberg home, which was not only the first faculty home into which I'd been invited, but really became a kind of salon of outrageous intellectual thinking and speculation that was very exciting. It was just wonderful as a student to have access to faculty in that way and to be able to mix with a lot of people from the university community and discuss interesting subjects and ideas. One of the things that Norman and I had in common is that I think we were both and are both fundamentally optimistic and cheerful, and that in looking at subjects that were very difficult, we nonetheless, as I said, despite all appearances to the contrary, had an underlying optimism about the prospects for human beings and societies to come to terms with the problems posed by drugs in their midst. And we came to that optimism in different ways and had different pieces of evidence to put together. And I'd just like to give you some highlights of that. As an ethnobotany student, which again was a very unfashionable career at that point, I really had the misfortune to come into ethnobotany just at the end of the previous cycle of interest on the part of pharmaceutical companies, which had begun in the early 1950s, so that there was no funding available for any kind of research or doing things in the rainforest. And I worked for a lot of years in that field and got out of it just before the present cycle of interest started, and it got back into fashion. But my major professor here was Richard Evan Schultes, who was the longtime director of the Harvard Botanical Museum. And I was on his staff at the Harvard Botanical Museum for 14 years. And beginning in my first year of medical school, I began making trips to the Amazon. And for quite a long period in the 1970s, I spent extended periods in South America, mostly in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, interested particularly in native peoples and their uses of plants. I was interested in medicinal plants, food plants, and definitely in psychoactive plants. I saw again and again in the cultures that I stayed with living examples of societies that used abundantly and frequently psychoactive substances and had no problems with them. I've written up some of those examples. One that I'll just mention to you briefly. It was a tribe called Cubeos who lived in Colombia in the rainforest near the border of Brazil. I had lived with them to observe their uses of coca, the natural source of cocaine. Almost all that has been written about coca leaf has been written in Andean communities at high altitude. But there is very great use of coca at sea level in the Amazon rainforest, which has not been paid much attention to by anthropologists or ethnobotanists. And I thought this would be an interesting place to look at things because in the Andean cultures, life is so difficult. Food is scarce, the environment is very harsh, it's very difficult to draw conclusions about anything you see associated with the use of any particular substance. Whereas the Amazonian cultures are generally well fed, the shelter is not a major problem, and so forth. And in this tribe, the coca leaf was prepared fresh every day. It was a very long process of picking leaves, toasting them, pounding them to a powder. It was a lot of work. And actually, I think having to do a lot of work to make your drug plants is one thing that probably protects you from getting into bad relationships with them. You know, it's much easier if you just buy things from a stranger to not think of them in the same way as you do when you have to invest a lot of energy in getting them and preparing them. Traditionally, in the Cubeo and other Amazonian peoples, coca was used only by adult men. At the time that I started visiting them, that taboo was beginning to break down and women in the tribe were beginning to use it. But it was never used by adolescents or children. And every hut in this village that I lived in had a can or tube of prepared coca that was just there for the taking. The circumstances in which I saw it used were in the morning to do physical work, and then they would prepare the coca in the afternoon and begin using it, and it was then a major social drug. I'd say it combined the functions of coffee and chewing gum in our society. People would sit around, put coca in their mouths, talk about the day's events, sometimes play music, sometimes dance. I never saw anything that I could characterize as abuse of coca. And I should say here that my definition of abuse, and Norman's also, is any use of a substance that seriously threatens a person's health or interferes with their social or economic functioning. It is absolutely unhelpful to define drug abuse in terms of which drug is being used. If you say that there are such things as drugs of abuse, which I think is just a fancy way of saying a drug you don't like, or a drug that you're not making money off of, then you create a problem of insoluble proportions. If everyone smoking marijuana is an abuser of marijuana, there's no possibility of ever coming to terms with that problem. But if abuse is defined in a legitimate way as something which is a concern to individuals and society, then I think we've got a manageable problem. I saw nothing that I could call abuse of coca leaf. I saw no addiction to coca leaf. These Indians would sometimes have to leave their villages for up to a year at a time to hire out as rubber cutters in other parts of the forest. And during that time that they go away, they would have no access to coca. And they would say that they missed it because they liked it, but they suffered no withdrawal. It didn't disrupt their lives. The oldest man in the village, who I estimated as being in his early 70s, and was by far the heaviest user of coca, his chin was green most of the time from the amount that he used, was in better physical and mental shape than most 70-year-olds that I see in our culture, and could row a canoe faster than I could. So I saw this substance was fully integrated into their life. And one of the most striking things to me was the total absence of curiosity on the part of young people about coca. In this society, there was no attempt to limit use or regulate use through externally imposed criminal laws or prohibitions. There was simply an accepted social process that this was a substance used by men mostly when you became an independent householder. When you married and had your own home, then you began using coca. I asked every kid I could find in this village, I would talk to them in Spanish, don't you want to know what coca is like? No. Aren't you interested to know what it feels like? No. Don't you want to know how it makes your dad feel when he uses it? No, I'll wait till I grow up. I've never heard kids in our society say things like that. I would argue that one of the main things we have done by criminalizing and prohibiting those drugs that we don't like is to make them incredibly attractive to young people. And the example that in every case where I have looked at cultures where there are no criminal laws and criminal prohibitions, one of the correlations I see is an absence of curiosity, especially on the part of young people about these substances. At any rate, from a number of years of experience of this sort in South America, I became convinced that it was indeed possible for human beings to work out their peace with psychoactive substances, and that the principles that I saw at work in these South American Indian cultures seemed to me to be very applicable to our own culture. You know, it was very easy when I tried to talk about this up here for people to dismiss all this by saying, oh, well, these Indians have nothing to do with us. I think the main difference that I saw in those cultures that made it easier for them is that they were very homogeneous cultures, so that it's very easy to get a cultural consensus going. You know, we're at the opposite extreme of that. We are an incredibly heterogeneous, diverse culture that can't agree about much of anything. So it's much harder to get a social consensus going. Nonetheless, it's possible. But except for that difference, it seems to me that on the level at which these people were dealing with the potential of psychoactive substances to cause disruption, they had solved that problem very neatly, and that there was a great deal to be learned from them. Norman and I were both extremely committed to the idea that the effects of drugs are extraordinarily influenced by set and setting, that pharmacology is just one of three factors that determine how human beings react to them. Set is a psychologist term for the expectations that people have about what drugs will do to them, and often these expectations can be unconscious. And setting is the whole milieu environment in which drugs are taken, which can be the social environment, the cultural environment, the historical cultural environment as well. I focused a great deal on set, on expectation. In 1968, Norman Zinnberg and I conducted the first double-blind human experiments with marijuana here in Boston. And one of the experiences that most impressed me in doing those experiments was to see human subjects who had never had marijuana sitting in a sterile laboratory environment with no expectation of what was going to happen to them, who would smoke marijuana and have all the physical signs of doing so. Actually, it wasn't very hard to tell who had gotten marijuana and who hadn't, because some people had red eyes and their heart rates went up 30 points. And these people would be sitting there saying, did I have a drug tonight? I can't believe that I got the real thing tonight. It was very impressive to see that. That is, that the effect of marijuana on its own, relatively isolated from the influence of set and setting was very, very unimpressive. It was a very unimpressive pharmacological agent in that circumstance. The situation was quite different when we used people who were users of marijuana in that setting. They got high, they had all sorts of experiences, mostly pleasant, some unpleasant, but there were dramatic changes which the naive users did not have. Norman focused a great deal on setting, on the environmental factors that shaped the effects of drugs. And I should say, by the way, that pharmacologists were not very happy to hear us talking this way, because pharmacologists have a vested interest in seeing pharmacology as being the sole determinant of drug use, and don't want to hear about these other messy variables that can't be quantified, like dose and route of administration. So there was a great deal of opposition within the pharmacological community to admitting the reality of set and setting, even though that lip service would often be paid to these variables. They weren't really taken seriously. And I think one of the major contributions that Norman Zinnberg made to this field happened when he was sent to Vietnam by the US Army as a consultant to study the problem of heroin use among American military personnel. There was an epidemic of heroin use among GIs in Vietnam. It was mostly smoked, which is a very efficient way of putting it into the system. At many Army bases, you could buy heroin-impregnated cigarettes of either marijuana or tobacco very, very cheap. They were abundant, easy to get. And a very high percentage of American Army personnel began smoking heroin on a regular basis. The Army was terrified about this. One of the reasons they were terrified was that everyone was convinced that when these people came back home, they would enormously swell the ranks of domestic opiate addicts, because the model of classical pharmacology predicts that if you use an opiate regularly, there are biochemical changes in your body which require you to go on using it, otherwise you experience a very uncomfortable withdrawal. Norman went around and interviewed large numbers of people at Army bases, and his conclusion was quite different. He felt that the major phenomenon that was shaping and driving heroin use in Vietnam was setting, that it was the special setting of life in Vietnam for military personnel that encouraged people to use this substance and find the effects of it desirable. His main conclusion from interviewing lots of Army heroin users was that their chief experience in Vietnam was boredom. They were incredibly bored in an unpleasant reality that they didn't want to be in. And heroin is a very appealing drug in those circumstances. It makes time pass faster, and it insulates you from unpleasant sensations. And his feeling was that if you took these people out of Vietnam, it would cut off that source of motivation, and they would not go on using heroin. So here was a prediction completely at variance with the prediction of classical pharmacology. Norman's conclusion, which he gave to the Army at the end of his tour, was that the Army should end the war in Vietnam as quickly as possible and bring people home, which the Army was not prepared to hear at that point, although shortly afterwards they were. His predictions were completely borne out by subsequent research. There were a great many surveys done of the patterns of drug use by heroin-smoking GIs in Vietnam when they came back to this country. The percentage that continued to use heroin was on the order of 1% to 2%. And of the ones who gave it up, none of them talked about having problems of withdrawal. That's very interesting. I mean, that is an example of the power of setting to change the effects of a drug. Now, I think that our interest in set and setting was one of the major sources of our optimism and cheerfulness about the drug problem, because it suggests that effects of drugs are plastic. That is, that you may not like what drugs seem to be doing, but there is great potential to change what drugs do to people by changing how they think about them and the setting in which they use them. That seems to me to be a very encouraging conclusion. The effects of drugs are not fixed in stone, and that what we see drugs doing in our culture may not be what they always have to do, and there might be ways that we as individuals in a culture can change circumstances so that even if these drugs are present, they aren't causing the kinds of problems that we see out there that we don't like. And as I say, I think this was a major reason why we remain quite optimistic, despite all appearances to the contrary. Over the years, I have watched our culture struggle with the problem of drugs and drug policy, and I haven't really seen any fundamental changes in what we're doing. It seems to me that we are still operating from the basic premise that what we have to do is make the substances we don't like disappear and make people stop using them. I think there is not a shred of evidence from history or from anthropology to suggest that that's a possible goal. There is no culture in history that I have been able to discover that has not been heavily involved with the use of psychoactive substances, with the possible exception of some traditional Eskimo cultures who had the misfortune not to be able to grow things and had to wait for us to give them alcohol, which they quickly learned to abuse horribly. So I think that whenever you hear politicians or others talking about creating a drug-free America, right there, that is the source of a major problem that we've got. First of all, nobody intends to create a drug-free America anyway. I mean, nobody is trying to make alcohol, tobacco, and coffee go away, for example. And yet those drugs are as powerful as many of the illegal drugs, and in some cases, medically and psychologically, much more dangerous than some of the illegal ones. So all that these people want to do is make some drugs go away. As I said, the ones they don't like, the ones that are associated with deviant subcultures, the ones that the government is not making money off of. As long as we pursue that phantasmic goal, there is no possibility, zero, whatever, of making any progress with our situation about drugs. So that's the first thing that has to be given up. I would also say that until we are willing to abandon the use of criminal law as an attempt to influence people's drug-taking behavior, the taking of drugs that we don't like, there is also no progress to be made. The criminal law is a completely ineffective, not only ineffective, but seriously counterproductive vehicle for trying to change people's drug-taking behavior. The only thing it does is influence it in worse directions. And as I said, that is the pattern that I can clearly identify in American history in the past 100 years. It's interesting to look back 100 years ago to a time before we had any drug laws and see what the situation was. In 1896, probably as many people were using psychoactive drugs as now. But there were great differences. The main problems in 1896 were two. The first was that the medical profession was prescribing addictive and dangerous drugs without appreciating their dangers and using them as cure-alls. I don't think that's changed a whole lot, except that which drugs are in fashion has changed. Now it's benzodiazepines, for example, and Ritalin for kids, probably. But I don't think there's been too much change there, and I don't think the medical profession has learned a great deal from its mistakes. Most of the most of the drugs that are causing problems in our culture today were first introduced to people by medical doctors in the belief that they were panaceas with no downside. The second problem in 1896 was that there were a great many patent medicines that people could buy over the counter that contained addictive substances and didn't say so on the label. That problem was ended by the passage of the first Food and Drug Act in 1906. But except for that, I don't think there were a whole lot of problems back then that are equivalent to what we have today. There was absolutely no criminal activity associated with the distribution and use of drugs. These vast criminal networks that have sprung up that cause so much violence in our cities, that have clogged our court systems and prisons, did not exist. That is a creation of our policies of criminal prohibition. The forms of drugs in use were much healthier. In general, people were taking natural forms of drugs, usually by mouth, rather than injecting or snorting or smoking highly refined, concentrated forms. It's not in anybody's interest in a criminalized situation to smuggle coca leaves. Who's going to bother smuggling bales of coca leaves? But it's in everybody's interest to smuggle very compact units of refined cocaine that are worth a fortune. That, again, is entirely something that we have created. In 1896, kids didn't use drugs. The age of drug use has steadily dropped in our culture, and all people can think to do when they see this happening is to get tougher on drugs. And they don't seem to see that it's their actions which produce the phenomenon. People in 1896 did not take drugs to drop out of society or to express anger against authorities. Those are also all creations of the policies that we've tried to implement. Norman was also a great champion of social controls as an appropriate means of regulating drug use. If criminal law is not an effective medium, what can you do? He looked at social processes. He focused particularly on alcohol and heroin. One of the major studies that he did was of successful users of heroin, which was, again, a very unpopular subject in those days because the general dogma was that if you were going to use heroin, you had to be an abuser of it. That is, there was no way of using that drug safely. You were either an addict or you were an abstinent. By the way, there's an interesting historical parallel to that. During the epidemic of alcoholism that happened in this country in Europe in the early 1800s, following the introduction of distilled beverages in the 1700s, there was a degree and extent of alcoholism that has not been seen since. And at that time, a very common belief was that there was no safe way to use that substance, that either you were abstinent or you were a drunkard. It took Europeans and Americans about 100 years maybe to work out their peace with alcohol, so that now we have, say, only 10% of people who use that substance being addictive and abusers, which is still not great, but it's a lot better than 95%, which it was back then. And that's, I think, a great historical example of how a social process can curb the destructive tendency of drugs. In his studies of heroin users, I think another point that came up, which I've always tried to encourage people to look at, is that I think our research community has made a very serious tactical error in focusing on abusers. You know, I think we do this, I again see a parallel here with medicine. You know, we focus on disease, we don't focus on health. We look at how people get sick, we don't look at how they get well. In the same way, we look at people who get into bad relationships with drugs, we don't look at people who are in successful relationships with drugs to see what we can learn from them. You know, what is it that enables some people to use an addictive drug like heroin in a way that doesn't cause physical addiction, that doesn't cause disruption of their life, that doesn't lead them to join criminal undergrounds? That's very interesting. Or an even more interesting case to me is to look at non-addictive cigarette users. Now, tobacco in the form of cigarettes is the most addictive drug known. There is nothing that comes close to it except crack cocaine, and for very similar reasons, that these are both very powerful stimulants. Actually, nicotine is a little stronger than cocaine. And the manner of introducing it into the brain by inhalation of vapors is the most direct and most dangerous way to put a drug into the system. And for that reason, the patterns of addiction that form around these substances are the worst of all. They form most quickly, they're the most difficult to break, they cause the most kinds of disruption in people's lives. How is it that some people are able to smoke cigarettes non-addictively? And that has always interested me, and I have searched out non-addicted cigarette users, and I'll just tell you a few observations I've made about them. Most of the people that I've met who use cigarettes non-addictively never were addicted. And that's vast majority, which seems to argue in favor of the idea that once you get into an abusive relationship with a substance, maybe your only options are to go on being an abuser or to be abstinent. And that certainly argues for prevention as the strategy we should be focusing on rather than treatment. But another observation I make is that non-addicted smokers get high from smoking their cigarettes. You know, some will tell you they get a buzz or they get a rush. They get something interesting pharmacologically, which addicted smokers lose. And the non-addicted cigarette smokers that I know have discovered that if they smoke above a certain frequency, they lose an experience that they like. And they have come up with rules for limiting their frequency, all different. I know one woman who only smokes cigarettes in the company of a woman friend who's an addicted smoker. She bums cigarettes from her, and that's the only time she smokes. I know a man who only smokes two cigarettes after dinner every night, and that's all he smokes. Very interesting. If I were in charge of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a very unlikely event, I would put a great deal of money into studying non-addictive cigarette smokers. I think there's a lot to be learned from them. You know, what is it? Is this something genetic? Is it something biochemical? Is it something learned? I don't know. Is it a combination of all those? But I think we'd have a great deal to learn from that. Norman loved to point out that alcohol in our culture was a drug regulated mostly by social process and social consensus. He liked to say that let's have a drink was one of the most frequent phrases we hear in our culture. And that's interesting what's said in it. It's let's have a drink. It's not let's get drunk. It's not let's down a bottle of booze. It's let's have a drink. And this is used as an invitation to use alcohol for a particular purpose, that is for facilitating social interaction for a specified period of time. These are all ways, again, of containing the destructive potential of a powerful psychoactive substance. I think, again, you have an interesting example right in front of your eyes of the power of social controls to regulate the destructive potential and societal uses of a very, very dangerous substances in looking at the evolution of our society's attitudes towards tobacco, which are in the midst of rapid change at the moment. Now, it is quite amazing to go back to cultural images from the 1930s and 1940s and compare them to now in terms of smoking. Sometime in the past year, I rented a movie that was made in 1938. Everyone in the movie smoked all the time. There was not a moment when characters on the screen were not with cigarettes. The hero smoked all the time. The heroine smoked all the time. There was an evil psychiatrist who smoked all the time. How could you have grown up in America in that era and not wanted to smoke if all of your cultural icons are doing it on the screen? You don't have to go back even that far. If you will look at Life magazines in the library from the 1950s, you will find doctors in white coats selling cigarettes. You'll find there are doctors in white coats with mirrors on their forehead holding out packs of old golds and saying, "I recommend these to all my patients because they're soothing to the throat." Imagine that. That's not that long ago. We have witnessed an incredible cultural transformation with regard to our attitudes towards cigarettes. Actually, back in the, cigarettes were issued in emergency rations to GIs through most of the major wars in this century. And the common cultural belief was that cigarettes were a good thing because they helped people concentrate and made people work more efficiently. What we have seen happen in the past 10 years is that smoking is going out of fashion. It's certainly going out of fashion among the educated middle classes in this country. And that is a striking social cultural change, affecting even this most powerful, most addictive, most medically dangerous substance. To me, that is a source of tremendous optimism. It shows the power that society has through a process of generating a social consensus. And here again, as an example, we may not be Indians in the Amazon, but even in our diverse culture, with so many different kinds of people holding so many different views, nonetheless, it is possible to generate a social consensus about a drug which can drastically change patterns of consumption, even in the case of a drug that's so addictive. Again, this was a point that Norman used to talk about at great length, that I try to talk about now, and to me is a reason to remain, despite all appearances out there, optimistic about the possibility of our society coming to terms with this problem that we live with. So let me just give you just a few points of what I think has to change if we're going to see things get better. And I really feel, I honestly believe that things could change in the twinkling of an eye if we would begin just to change our orientation and thinking about these substances. The first is there has to be an acknowledged commitment to back away from the use of criminal law and criminal prohibitions as a means of trying to regulate behavior around the substances we don't like. That does not mean legalizing drugs overnight. It means backing away from this policy that we've built up. And I would see, I would be in favor of a gradual, stepwise dismantling of this whole superstructure of laws, giving time at each step to let society adjust and see what happens. I don't think this has to be done according to any timetable, but it requires an acknowledgement that this is not the way to do it and that we have to find other ways. And I say this because I think that the chances of getting social controls operating are much, much reduced in a criminalized, prohibited atmosphere. I think that actively interferes with the kinds of learning, social and cultural learning that need to happen. Secondly, I think I would like to see increasing, and this could also be done in a gradual, stepwise fashion, curtailing of all advertising and promotion of all psychoactive substances. And I will include caffeine in that as well as alcohol and tobacco. I think that all these things have to be just there, and there is no attempt either to discourage people from using them or to encourage people from using them. And then finally, I think we have to have real drug education in our culture. And this is the Chinese approach to a problem. It's that we're not trying to make the drugs go away or prevent access to them, but we are trying to build resistance into people. We are trying to make our citizens more resistant to the temptations of drugs by making them aware of what are the real risks, as well as acknowledging what the real benefits are. I see none of this today out there in what's called drug education. All of it looks to me like the same old thing. It's thinly disguised attempts to scare young people away from the drugs we don't like by exaggerating their dangers while not being honest about the drugs that we promote and make money off of, and that doesn't work. But I think that real drug education could be done, and I think if we moved in all of those three areas, that is, backing away from a commitment to the criminal law as a means of affecting people's drug behavior. Secondly, curtailing the promotion and commercialization of all psychoactive drugs. And thirdly, really designing intelligent programs of drug education. And by the way, that has to be aimed at all people. I think physicians are in much need of drug education as kids are, because as I said, they've been responsible for causing a great deal of it in this culture. I think it's at every level of society that people need real education about what are the nature of these substances, what are the use of them. Obviously, also, I think it would be in our interest if we encouraged the availability, the use of natural dilute forms of substances as alternatives to the refined, concentrated forms of drugs that are much more liable to abuse. And I would argue for that in our use of medical drugs and treatment, as well as for our psychoactive drugs, the preferences in psychoactive drugs. And again, I'll just say here that I learned from Norman Zinnberg a lot of these first principles. I had very different experiences in the world in my travels in South America, but I think there was great congruence in our thinking, and that what we saw in the areas that we studied individually converged and both led us to retain a great sense of optimism about the possibility that our society, despite the mess it's gotten itself into, can begin to get itself out if it makes basic changes in those areas. So I will stop there, and I would like to continue by inviting your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for questions, and we have 2 microphones, one on each aisle. So if you would use the microphones, identify yourself if you wish, and ask a question.
My name is Dorothy Gilliam, and I'm a fellow at the Institute of Politics. Apropos to your first solution, many people believe that drugs have become the sanctioned underground economy of many urban areas. Therefore, the criminal aspect has become a very difficult part. We know that many African American men in particular are warehoused in jails all over the country, and there's a disproportionate sentencing for crack cocaine as opposed to powdered cocaine. Now, given the fact that it looks as though the government has turned against some of its own people and is using drugs as a way to starve them and put them in jail, I just wonder how your solution plays against that. And very briefly, just in the last month, the San Diego Union has begun to write stories about how the CIA went to and brought drugs from South America and sold them to gangs in Los Angeles. I have no knowledge about the veracity of that, but I just wonder how you see your solution playing out in view of some of the realities.
Well, again, all I can tell you is I think those realities are creations of the way that we have set drugs up in our culture and made them behave. I think that the criminal prohibition of the drugs we don't like has corrupted society in so many of its aspects. It's corrupted governments, it's corrupted court systems, it's corrupted the prison system, it has wreaked havoc in the governments and societies of the producing countries through the world. I mean, certainly the ones that I have firsthand knowledge of have been devastated politically and socially by our drug policies. That tribe of Indians, the Cubeos, who I lived with in the 1970s and who were in such a harmonious relationship with coca, I watched their disintegration in the space of 2 years when Colombian mafiosi moved into this remote area of the Amazon to try to round up Indians to grow coca for the cocaine trade. And the Indians, who really were very marginalized in terms of the cash economy of the region, were dazzled by the prospect of suddenly having something that they could get cash for, and abandoned growing their food crops in order to grow coca. They had access to speedboats, which they'd never had, and got down to a town where they could buy distilled liquor, which they'd never had. And in the space of 2 years, I watched this beautiful culture fall apart. as a result of what we're doing up here. It's our demand for drugs, it's our policies which reached all the way down there and destroyed that culture. So, you know, I think wherever you look, whether it's in the ghetto, whether it's in inner cities, whether it's among African Americans, whether it's Indians in South America, whether it's opium growers in Southeast Asia, I think our policies, which have set the tone for the world, have caused immense cultural and social damage. And I think that if we could back away from those policies and find other models for managing drugs in our culture, all of that would begin to improve. I think it's all one piece, and it's one ugly, nasty piece, and we've made it happen.
Okay, hi. My name's Amelia Kaplan, and I'm a senior at the college. And my question is more about mind-body integration and the future of medicine. And I know it's not quite the topic tonight. But just a few words, just what would you tell someone who's thinking about defining a career that integrates the mind and the body, about going to medical school or finding paths outside? I'm just curious.
Well, I was talking with students at Harvard Medical School this morning, where I hadn't been back to in a long time. And I joked with someone this afternoon, I was telling them that their profession was doomed. And I mean, the fact is that there is an enormous loss of public confidence in medicine as it's now practiced, and in their frustration, consumers are turning in increasing numbers to alternative providers. When I get questions like yours, what I usually tell people is, if you think you can stand it, you should grit your teeth and go through medical school and get an MD. First of all, that is by far the most powerful degree you can have in the health professions. Secondly, people have enormous confidence still in MDs, really. They believe in the power of MDs. And the only way the medical profession is going to change faster is if people like you go into it and retain that orientation. And if you do go to medical school, I would urge you, at every opportunity that you're given free time, however little that may be, get out and learn something that you're not learning there. And there are many possibilities for learning techniques that are based on the premise of mind-body integration, such as hypnotherapy, guided imagery therapy, which are time and cost efficient, fun to practice, fun for both patient and practitioners, and highly effective for producing changes in some of the conditions for which our best high-tech pharmacological solutions are ineffective.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I wonder whether you could elaborate on a point that you made during your talk. I'm sort of left with the impression that drugs are basically just another toxic material which, when they go above a certain threshold, can have very harmful effects, and that the body just can't deal with them. Whereas if they stay below that threshold, then the body in its healing processes, which you describe in your most recent book, can sort of take care of that also. And what it really boils down to is to stay below toxic levels and have trust in what the body can do.
There is certainly no difference between a drug and a poison except dose, something that I always try to talk to medical students about. If you push the dose of any drug up high enough, you'll begin to poison people, and one way that you find new pharmaceutical treatments is to look at poisons and see if you can get the dose down low enough to where you get useful therapeutic effects from them. So I think that principle is quite true. What is a toxic level for one person may be very different from what is a toxic level for another person. Also, in looking at that issue of toxicity, that again is reason why it's important to try to encourage people that, for instance, if you want to use a stimulant like cocaine, it's much smarter to put a coca leaf in your mouth than to inhale the vapors of crack cocaine. You know, that one of the great advantages of using these substances, and I think what protects a lot of these Indians, is that they're using dilute preparations. And plus, you can't snort a coca leaf. You know, nature, the form of that dictates that it has to go into your mouth. And that puts the drug into your bloodstream more slowly, which, you know, a lot of the toxic effects of drugs are related more to the rate of increase of concentration in the brain and target organs than to the absolute dose. So that a very large dose of a drug taken slowly may be much more subtle in its effects than a very small dose that's introduced very rapidly. Now, that's, again, the problem with cigarettes as a drug delivery system. That's a very efficient, dangerous method of introducing nicotine into the brain. So I think your point is well taken. And again, I think that's part of what has to be in a basic drug education course. Yes.
My name is Lisa Purdy. I'm a Loeb Fellow here at the university. I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of the medical problems associated with caffeine.
Yes. one of my favorite subjects. First of all, I would just say, as a flip remark, that I have produced, in some occasions, one miracle cure every 2 weeks by just getting people to stop drinking coffee. That is not to say that coffee is a bad drug, but it is a strong drug, and it's one that's frequently associated with addiction in our culture. I would estimate that about 80% of coffee users are addicted, and that's a physical addiction with a real physical withdrawal syndrome. And I often see coffee, and coffee is the strongest form of caffeine. You can see this with other kinds of caffeine, but coffee is the strongest. I would say that caffeine and coffee are the most unconsciously used drugs in the world. I mean, there's very little awareness of their nature or their dangers. And there is often very little awareness of their significance in medical problems. I see many patients who have problems that are either directly caused by caffeine or aggravated by caffeine, who have been to doctor after doctor, and no one has asked them about their caffeine intake. I saw an extreme example of this. I have a file of cases of men who were admitted to neurology wards for evaluation of hand tremors, who were put through expensive and dangerous neurological workups before anyone asked them about their coffee intake. It was usually a nurse, not a doctor, who asked. And some of these people were drinking 40 cups of coffee a day. And that was the reason their hands were shaking. I sat in this morning at Harvard Medical School on a little seminar that had to do with the differential diagnosis of epilepsy. And there was 2 cases, one involving a woman with panic disorder and one who had a seizure disorder. The symptoms were very similar. And one of the things that all the students had up on the board was toxic effects and drug effects. And I said to them, what drug would you first think of in cases of panic disorder or seizure disorders that might produce anxiety and agitation and so forth? And you should have heard the esoteric answers that came out there. I mean, it was PCP and this and that. And I said, that's not what I would think of. I would think of coffee, and I would ask about coffee intake. And whatever the organic basis of those illnesses, if people are taking a lot of caffeine, you can dramatically improve their situation by getting them off it. The conditions that I see caffeine make worse are all stomach problems, all intestinal problems, urinary and bladder problems, and prostate problems, because it's a strong diuretic and stimulant of the urinary system, any kind of tremors, insomnia, mood disorders, energy disorders, palpitations, heart arrhythmias. That's a pretty long list of things. So whenever you're dealing with patients with those conditions, it's very important to ask about caffeine intake and to suggest that they stop drinking it and see what happens.
In moderation, it
Absolutely,
could be, okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have absolutely no objection to people drinking coffee or using caffeine as long as they know what they're doing, as long as they're honest about what it is, that it's a drug, and know something about how it's affecting them, that it's a stimulant which is not giving you free gifts of energy, it's just forcing your nervous system to release chemically stored energy at a time when it normally wouldn't do that, and the result is you're going to have a depletion of energy when it wears off. And secondly, if you can use it in a non-addictive fashion that doesn't interfere with your health. It is quite interesting to listen to the accounts of withdrawal from coffee from people in this culture. Some people, and by the way, this does not have to do with the amount that you drink. It has to do with your individual sensitivity. I've seen people who drink 4 and 5 cups of coffee a day who do not have withdrawal when they stop, and I've seen people who drink 1 cup of coffee a day who have spectacular withdrawal when they stop. One friend of mine, the common symptoms are fatigue, which begins usually about 12 to 24 hours after the last dose and can become so profound that people can't get up from a horizontal position. And then a distinctive throbbing headache, a vascular headache, which is untouched by aspirin but magically relieved by Excedrin. And in some cases, I have seen now several cases of people who had periods of continuous vomiting in association with caffeine withdrawal. It's a strong drug. And that's not to say it's bad, it's just we should be aware of what it is. It's not, I think it's something that pours free out of motel walls, and it's served in great quantities at drug abuse conferences, and nobody ever thinks about it. I heard, I was once in San Francisco, and on the radio I kept hearing this commercial for Hills Brothers coffee, and the refrain, which was repeated 3 times each time the commercial was on, was, "Hills Brothers, the 10th cup tastes as good as the first." Amazing. First of all, it's not true. I mean, the 10th dose of nothing is as good as the first dose. But amazing when you listen to that and just look at, it's like the doctor saying old gold soothe the throat. Decaffeinated coffee is not inert. Coffee has other substances in it that synergize caffeine and have effects of their own. If people are very sensitive to caffeine, there may be enough caffeine in decaffeinated coffee to affect them, and even if not, there may be the other things there may affect them. For instance, the stomach irritants in coffee are not caffeine, they're other substances. So if people have problems like hiatal hernia or gastritis, ulcer, they shouldn't be on decaffeinated coffee either. So in general, if people have medical reasons not to drink coffee, they shouldn't drink decaffeinated coffee. Decaffeinated tea is inert, that's okay. And actually, with green tea especially, there have been a number of health benefits reported of green tea, and black tea as well. It's been found to have significant anti-cancer properties and cholesterol-lowering properties that have to do with peculiar components of tea.
So we have time for more questions if you're willing to continue.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so why don't we go on?
Thank you. In the last 5 to 10 years, a number of informal networks have developed between physicians and alternative practitioners, and there are now a handful of physicians who are also trained in acupuncture or herbal medicine or something like that. But aside from them, have these informal networks actually affected clinical practices of the physicians or the alternative practitioners? To what extent is that now happening?
What kind of networks are you thinking of?
As they're getting to know each other, they're starting
Okay.
to associate and get to know
Okay.
more about each other's business and so forth.
You know, what I would say is that I think a lot of the problems of why the medical profession has been so unresponsive to consumer demands for alternative methods is that there has been so little communication between medical doctors and other worlds. And I was telling the students this morning that when I was a student at Harvard Medical School in the late 60s, if acupuncture was mentioned at all, it was used as an example of how unenlightened a lot of the world's population was. And it was thought of in the same way as sticking pins into voodoo dolls. That changed instantly when James Reston had his emergency appendectomy on the front page of the New York Times during his visit to Peking, and reported that acupuncture relieved his postoperative pain. And suddenly, Americans wanted to pay actual money for acupuncture. And it was when American medical doctors saw that they suddenly took an interest in acupuncture. There is a tremendous market shift going on in the world today, especially in America, in which large numbers of patient dollars, numbering in the billions, are going to alternative providers. And it's entirely and solely in response to that the medical institutions are now beginning to open up to and express an interest in alternative practice. So I think this is happening. It's not happening as a result of any degree of argument or philosophizing. It's happening directly as a result of market pressures.
Do you see the physicians actually changing their clinical practices, for example, referring to alternative people or vice versa?
I see that beginning, and I see if they don't do it, they're going to be forced to do it. And I was also telling the students today that there was a law passed in Washington State a year ago now, which the rest of the country is watching with great interest. This was passed by an overwhelming majority in the Washington legislature, unprecedented majority, mandating that all health providers in the state of Washington have to include alternative practice, and insurance has to pay for it. The insurance commissioner of Washington is now being sued by all the insurance companies, which are in terror that this is going to raise their costs, which I don't think is the case. A similar measure will pass in 3 weeks in Oregon. And there are now 14 other states in which these measures are in some phase of going through the legislature. And clearly these are expressions of the will of the people who are intensely frustrated that medical institutions are not responding to their demands for this kind of coverage. So I think the lesson here is that if medical institutions do not start doing this, they're going to be forced to do it. And that may not be the best way to have it happen. So I think the lesson is not lost. And I think you're going to see in the next year or two a lot of change.
My name is Ralph Hoagland, and I'm doing research and thinking on how to significantly increase the use of herbs as a medical thing. Today, in the same New York Times that you were in, there was an announcement that the majority of adult Americans have a health risk, which is totally unexplainable. And it's interesting in looking around this audience, it doesn't look like anybody has it, and that's overweight to the point. And now the majority of Americans have that. Do you have any ideas about why that is growing at such a exponential type of rate?
Well, I'll give you a few. I think we eat too much and we don't exercise enough. I think television has contributed to that. I think computers have contributed to that. I think those are major forces reducing the amount of physical activity among kids. I think we eat larger portions of food than we did in the past. I think we eat fast food now, which we didn't a couple of generations ago, and that food is especially high in fat and in kinds of carbohydrates that predispose to obesity. I think many of us have inherited a genetic tendency to be very efficient at storing up calories that made a lot of sense in the distant past when we were living as hunter-gatherers, when food was available only sporadically, when we lived near starvation or had feast and famine. I think the survivors of that era are people who have genes, many of us, that are very, very efficient at storing up food when it's available. And that genetic constitution now works against us in an era when food is there not only all the time, but is offered to us in incredibly tempting variety and abundance. So I think those are some reasons for the problem. America is truly the land of the fat as well as the home of the free and the brave. And it is quite shocking to go out of America in any direction other than Canada and come back in and see what we look like. And it's especially shocking when you come in from Asia or from, from other directions to see how big we are. I mean, it's astonishing.
Well, just one follow-on comment. All the things that you listed have been present for quite some time, but in the last 10 years, there's been an incredible escalation.
I agree.
What's the new factor?
Maybe it has to do with the expansion of the universe. I don't know. I mean, it might be something karmic.
Hi, I'm Josh Brown. I'm an undergrad student here. I have two questions. One, who are your major detractors and what are their major criticisms?
Well, I mean, you can imagine, I think. All I can tell you is that, first of all, this is not really what I talk about mostly these days. Mostly my work, as I said, is in the area of health, medical education reform. I certainly have some detractors there too, but not very many anymore. And I don't go around the country talking about drugs and drug policy very much. What I can tell you is that The Natural Mind, which I wrote in 1971 and was published in 72, is still being used as a textbook in college courses on drugs. That chocolate to morphine is selling briskly and is used in many drug education circles.
That was banned at one point, right?
What's that?
That was banned by some schools?
There was an attempt to ban it. There was a senator from Florida who was a clone of Nancy Reagan, and the two of them were honorary chairpersons of something called the National Association of Parents for Drug-Free Youth, Paula Hawkins, and she made it as one of her election points to get chocolate to morphine banned from schools and libraries. She was on CBS News waving it around and got more publicity for it than the publisher had managed to do, which again, that's an example of when you try to make something you don't like go away by opposing it, often it takes worse forms than you had imagined. At any rate, that's all I can tell you. I think that the ideas that I've put out there are there, and the same for Norman Zinnberg's ideas. They're there, they're being used, they're influential, and obviously they are not yet at the level of influencing our social and public policy, but I remain optimistic about that.
My second question is, have you done much research with MDMA or ecstasy?
I know a great deal about that, and I have not done formal research with it, but I know a lot about it. And is there anything specific you want to know about it? It is not neurotoxic, this issue that has been raised about it.
How does it differ from other drugs like heroin?
It's a very interesting drug that has unique effects. This is a derivative of amphetamine that's somewhere between psychedelics and amphetamine. I think it has enormous therapeutic potential. It's a shame it's not available to the medical profession. We tend to, once we demonize a drug and put it into Schedule I, part of the mythology that's built up is that these substances can have no redeeming effects. I mean, that's why there's such an issue going on over medical uses of marijuana, for example. And it'll be interesting to see if this initiative in California passes, which it sounds as if it has a chance to. But the reason that this is so threatening is that it challenges the mythology that an evil drug must be wholly evil. In the same way, the reason we can't use heroin here medically, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to use heroin medically. It's no different from morphine, except that it's more potent, and that's an advantage in some medical situations. Sometimes when you give morphine to people in pain, they can't tolerate it because it causes awful itching or nausea. And in some of those people, you could maybe give a lower dose of heroin and get satisfactory analgesia without the side effects. Why shouldn't we be able to use it? British doctors can use it as a medical drug. We can't use it because to do so, would be to admit that there could be something good there, and we can't have that. And so in the same way with MDMA, there now has to be a whole rationale built up of why it's evil and dangerous and it destroys serotonin neurons in the brain. Actually, a very interesting thing to look at if you're interested in this issue. There's a pharmaceutical drug, which was fairly obscure until a few years ago, called fenfluramine, sold under the name Pondamin, which is now one of this combination of drugs being used to treat obesity. Fenfluramine causes exactly the same effect in animals as MDMA, that is depletion of serotonin neurons, but it does it at 5 times the potency of MDMA, and I haven't heard anyone breathe a whisper about the harmfulness of that effect or suggest that that's a reason for banning fenfluramine, which a pharmaceutical company is making millions off of. So again, it just points up the irrationality of the way that we've categorized some of these things and then the attempts that we use to rationalize them.
Do you think there's a mythical quality to talks about brain cell loss and
Yes.
loss of spinal fluid?
There is
things
only
like that?
one drug that reliably and regularly causes brain cell loss, and I'm sure you can tell me what that is. Alcohol. And it does it definitely and predictably, and that is the only drug out there commonly used that causes direct damage to neurons. Okay.
Hi, I'm Hillary. I'm an undergraduate at the college, and you started to touch on this in your last response, but I was wondering what your ideas were about the bust of the Cannabis Buyers Club in San Francisco, the recent arrest of Dennis Perone, and initiatives to legalize marijuana for
Well, I
medical use.
hope it will generate support for the initiative. You know, I hope it will further anger voters in California and generate support for voting for that initiative. If that initiative passes, that will be the first time that a state has defied the federal government and begun to disengage itself from the whole war on drugs mentality. And that would be a wonderful occurrence. It would make the federal drug authorities livid, and I think it would initiate debate at a level that might begin to get us somewhere. There's, by the way, a similar measure, or actually a even more far-reaching measure on the ballot in Arizona, which would liberate all people from prisons who were there for possession of anything and allow doctors to use any of these substances for purposes that they deem appropriate. And that is also given a chance of passage. And we in Arizona have been very happy to see all the attention diverted to California because nobody's noticing us very much.
So just how much of a chance do you think the initiative has?
Well, I would defer to a colleague of mine, Ethan Nadelman here, who is involved, who is head of the Linda Smith Center in New York and has been one of the key players in that California initiative. Do you want to make a comment about that?
The polls yesterday said about 52 to 35, but that's still seen as a narrow lead, and there's a fear that most of the undecided will vote no on the ballot this year. So it's touch and go.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Edward Kibarige, student at the Graduate School of Education, and I was wondering if whether you yourself or through the Center for Integrative Medicine, you've done any work with AIDS and HIV and the whole relationship. I'm interested specifically in the social hypnosis that in our culture with HIV, AIDS. If you think that there's a direct causal relationship, sounds like a stupid question, but I've been reading some literature from Dr. Zinnberg, and also the effect of drug policies such as AZT, and whether or not it has any effect.
I would say that if HIV is not the cause of AIDS, it is at least a very tightly bound cofactor. Because I don't know of any cases of people who have had AIDS who have not had HIV. So I've read Duesberg's arguments. They sound good on paper, but in practice I don't see any divergence there. I have worked mostly with people who are HIV positive and not had symptoms. And I've always been interested in the phenomenon of long-term symptom-free survivors. And for a long time it seems to me that medical authorities discounted the possibility that there were any such things. You know, the dogma was that if you get HIV, you're dead sooner or later. And now there are so many of these cases have surfaced that finally there was research attention paid to them. And also I thought it was interesting that when researchers first began to look at long-term survivors, the first interpretation was that this had to do only with the virus, that these people must be infected with a benign strain. That is, there was no admission that there could be host factors that might play a role. And now I'm happy to see that finally there is looking in the direction that it's an interaction between the organism and the host. And again, that opens up more optimistic pathways, because if host factors are involved, that might suggest things that you can suggest to people who are infected that might improve their chances of being in that group. I think the current generation of AIDS drugs, this cocktail combination of protease inhibitors and AZT, is an infinite advance over the use of AZT alone and drugs like it. And the clinical results so far look very good there. But I think that if people with HIV go on those regimens, that does not excuse them from paying attention to every aspect of lifestyle, because I think everything that people can do to improve their general health translates into improved health of the immune system and improved resistance. And I have seen in this group of long-term symptom-free survivors a lot of people who've used Chinese herbal medicine. And that's an area that just interests me greatly. I think there are a lot of things out there in that world that look as if they're non-toxic and have the ability to increase aspects of immune function that might help the host remain in balance with the organism.
And the second question, something you briefly touched on, just wondered what your thoughts were on Dr. Joycelyn Elders, who got fired for suggesting the legalization of drugs.
I thought she was great. I'm sorry she's not there anymore. Actually, she got fired not for that, but for suggesting that we should teach kids how to masturbate. Right. You know, an even more radical idea.
we only have time for one more question, and then we're going to unfortunately have to stop by the clock.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's a relatively suitable one then. My name's Jane Little, and I'm a journalist from England, and as such I'd quite like to ask something that might test the limits of your optimism. Basically, your approach here has been very successful and is taking off, and integrative medicine is a recognised field. If you cross the water to my homeland, the grand old men of the British Medical Association, for instance, only last week recognised the existence of chronic fatigue syndrome as a viable medical condition, and feel very it seems to me they feel very threatened or bemused or anything outside of the traditional field of medicine. How are you going to convince and convert the rest of the world?
They should feel threatened, and I'm not going to try to convince them. The same thing that happens here is going to happen there. And if you look around the world, you can see exactly the same economic forces coming into alignment. In every country where technological medicine is dominant, the same kind of economic collapse is beginning to happen. The bills can't be paid. Insurance systems are broken down. I was in England about a year and a half ago, and the headlines were all that the National Health Service, the pride and joy of England, can no longer afford to pay for free medical care for all citizens. Same thing is happening everywhere. And the consumers movement that I spoke about here is happening everywhere as well, but to different degrees. I would say England is about maybe 5 to 7 years behind the United States. The United States is maybe 5 to 7 years behind Germany. It's quite amazing to look at what's happening in Germany, where now German physicians have to pass a section of their licensing exams on botanical medicine. I mentioned to the students this morning that there's a plant called St. John's wort, Hypericum, which has very excellent antidepressant effects, is now being prescribed 3-to-1 over Prozac and its relatives by German physicians. A standardized extract is made by the German pharmaceutical company Bayer. It's a fraction of the cost of Prozac and has no toxicity. And physicians in this country are ignorant of that, and our FDA will not let the Bayer product in the country. So, you can look, you see it's staggered. I'd say Japan is about 10 years behind us. Japan is a country where the natural authoritarianism of Japanese culture has found a splendid marriage with the authoritarianism of the medical profession to produce results that are so outlandish. You can see the faults of our system blown up huge. You never ask a Japanese doctor a question, for example. Japanese doctors now see 30 patients an hour, many of them. They're called 2-minute doctors. An American friend of mine, a woman, was in Tokyo and got sick and was taken to a Japanese clinic. The nurse took a history. She was taken into a room. The doctor came in, looked at the history, looked at her, handed her a prescription, and she said, "Why do I need to take this?" He didn't answer but turned red and walked out, and she was left alone in the room, and after 15 minutes she went out to find out what happened. The nurse told her she had insulted the doctor and he would not be back. Even in this culture, now there is the beginning of an angry, disaffected consumers movement and a movement toward alternative medicine. This is a genuine worldwide sociocultural trend. And the old men of the British medical profession should very much feel threatened. The same change is going to happen there.
Good. I'll be on the battlements.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thank you and good night.